Welcome to our panel on decolonization in practice. I'm Juliet Johnson. I have the honor of being the president of this amazing association this year. What I have for you here today is 6 wonderful younger scholars who have thought deeply about decolonization and what it means. And let me tell you, this plenary is going to be a little bit different than most of the kinds of things we do. And the first difference is that we're videotaping it. So we're all going to be speaking from this microphone. We're videotaping it. We're going to have closed captions, and this will be available afterwards and will be accessible. So, if you find it interesting, tell others. It's not a one-off chance to hear from these wonderful scholars. The other thing we're going to do is there are 6 of them. They're only 75 minutes. The floor is theirs. They are going to speak the whole time. So you can ask questions of other people at other times. We're here to hear from them. So let me introduce you to this amazing panel. And I'll introduce them in the order they'll be speaking. First of all, we've got Viktoriia Savchuk, who's a PhD candidate and instructor at the University of Maryland. Her research primarily focuses on Ukraine's strategic communication in response to Russia's full-scale invasion. Viktoriia has over 7 years of experience working as a communications specialist for government and nonprofit organizations in Ukraine and in the US, and is also a proud Fulbright alum, as are many. Zukhra Kasimova is an assistant professor of Eurasian history at Bucknell University. She's currently working on her first book manuscript, tentatively titled Orphans into Soviet Uzbekistanis, Wartime Mass Adoption Movement, Post-War Orphanages, and Hybrid Identities, 1941 to 1981. Jennie Schulze is an associate professor, she's the oldster here, besides me, in the Department of Political Science, and she's the director of the Center for Migration, Displacement, and Community Studies at Duquesne University. Her book, Strategic Frames, Europe, Russia, and Minority Inclusion in Estonia and Latvia, received an honorable mention for the Joseph Rothschild Book Prize in Nationalism and Ethnic Studies, and she's currently working on a new comparative book project on the challenges of refugee resettlement during times of crisis. Brian Yang is a PhD student at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the Department of Slavic Literatures and Languages. His research focuses on reframing the study of Russia away from imperial centers to indigenous peoples and indigenous perspectives. His current project analyzes indigenous Siberian literatures with critical indigenous theory to understand how indigenous peoples in the late Soviet Union practiced politics of refusal to subvert colonial prescriptions of authenticity. Our 5th speaker, Darya Tsymbalyuk, is an interdisciplinary researcher interested in environmental humanities, decolonial, feminist, and critical theory. She received her PhD in 2021 from the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, and is currently a visiting fellow at the School of Advanced Study, University of London, where she's working on a monograph about the environmental impacts of Russia's war in Ukraine. This is forthcoming with Polity Press. And she's also, and everybody congratulate her, a recipient of the Mary Zirin Prize from the Association for Women in Slavic Studies for this year. Yay. And finally, Chelsi West Ohueri is a socio-cultural anthropologist and assistant professor in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, with appointments in the departments of anthropology, African and African diaspora studies, and population health. So she truly does it all. Her scholarship and teaching are primarily concerned with the study of race and racialization, belonging, marginalization, and medical anthropology. She's conducted extensive ethnographic research throughout Albania and the Balkan region, and is interested in configurations of racial belonging among Albanian, Romani, and Egyptian communities, as well as the reproduction of whiteness and blackness in this region and throughout Europe. So after her own remarks, she's going to offer some summary and closing remarks on our plenary session, and that is the last you will hear from me at this panel. So please, Viktoriia.
Yes. Hello. We have the same name, different spelling, same name. We were both born in Western Ukrainian cities. Both of our hometowns start with L, Lutsk and Lviv. I'm standing here today after I was asked to share my perspective as a young scholar about decolonization in practice. She cannot be here. 5 months ago, Russia killed her. I want to dedicate my speech to Viktoriia Melina. As she used to introduce herself, Ukrainian writer, Joseph Conrad Prize awardee, founder of a literary festival in the Donetsk region, war crimes researcher at Truth Hounds in Ukraine. Today I plan to talk about the need to use accurate terminology. Academia needs to finally stop using euphemisms like conflict in Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine conflict, or events in Ukraine. It's the Russian war against Ukraine. We need to call out the aggressor and call things as they are. I also want to ask you to call the capital of Ukraine Kyiv, not Kiev, spell Odessa and Donbass with one S and Chernobyl with an O. Spelling them in Russian way is supporting the Russian colonization of Ukraine. Besides, I wanted to call to revisit Russia's place in academic and cultural discourses. Academia should start treating Russian imperialism and soft power as one of the factors that enabled the ongoing war in Ukraine and instabilities in other countries. When I started my studies in the US, I was surprised not to find myself, a woman from so-called former Second World, in all this literature on colonialism. I was also surprised to learn that the Soviet Union was viewed as a friendship of republics rather than a brutal occupation with genocide. It was shocking to me because my family experienced firsthand the Soviet friendship in the form of repressions, war, and hunger. The 2023 study by Yuri Horodnichenko and Tatiana Deryugina and Ilona Solovuk calls for the academic world to stop being Russian-centric and adopt a balanced approach to Slavic studies. I want to second that. According to this study, 82% of Slavic literature courses in the US universities are actually Russian literature courses. Some of these courses also appropriate literature from other countries. Isn't this a form of colonialism? For example, one Russian literature course covers Isaac Babel, a Jewish author from Odessa, Svetlana Alexievich, a Belarusian author, and Andrei Kurkov and Evgenia Belarusets both have Ukrainian passports. Isn't it ironic that Ukrainian writers are labeled as Russian authors in US universities as Russia attacks their hometowns? Besides, Deryugina et al. In 2023 found a number of literature courses devoted only to one artist or one author, disproportionately representing a particular country. 49 in Russian literature, 2 in Polish, and only 1 in Serbian. Shouldn't the works of other authors from countries other than Russia be given equal attention in the US? As Susan Smith-Peter 2023 mentioned, the history of the Russian Empire in the US has been seen through a Russian lens in the US. Horodnichenko et al. 2023 findings support this. They say that more than 1/3 of history courses focus exclusively on Russia. Some courses consider the Soviet Union as Russia. Courses on medieval Rus or Kyievska Rus classify it as Russian history, despite its involvement in Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and Polish history as well. Ukraine is often overlooked in academic instruction, leaving many generations of students unaware of the country's unique identity in Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, some Ukraine experts who are graduates of Russian studies tend to view Ukraine through a Russian lens. This lack of understanding has led to numerous mistakes in interpreting Ukraine or predicting its fall within 3 days after Russian full-scale invasion in February 2022. Therefore, we need to give more visibility to the research work done by scholars from Ukraine and other countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, who are not associated with Russian institutions. This can be achieved by citing their work, collaborating with them, reading publications, reading in languages rather than Russian and English. Engaging with other disciplines can be highly beneficial as well. As someone who works in the fields of strategic communication and public relations, I noticed the lack of case studies and perspectives from Eastern Europe. Most research focuses on only 4 countries: the US, the UK, China, and South Korea, according to Jane et al. In 2014. I firmly believe that there is a great potential of bringing stories and perspectives from other parts of the world to this and other fields. So, diversifying academia, bringing more diverse voices, and partnering across countries and disciplines are all essential aspects of decolonization in practice. However, as I began to prepare this speech, I realized that for me, decolonization is first and foremost about supporting Ukrainians in their struggle for survival. Viktoriia Savchuk published an essay in March 2022, in which she warned that Ukraine's cultural community is facing a similar fate to the executed Renaissance. During the 1930s, the Soviet regime executed the majority of Ukrainian writers and intellectuals, leaving the few survivors scared and unfree. This wasn't the first time the Ukrainian elite had been erased or forced to assimilate into Russian imperial culture. In September 2022, right after the liberation of the Kharkiv region, Viktoriia dug out the occupation diary of the Ukrainian writer Volodymyr Vakulenko, who was kidnapped and killed by Russian troops. In June 2023, Vakulenko's diary was published with Amelina's foreword. Viktoriia wrote, "For me, because my worst fear was coming true, that I was in the middle of a new executed Renaissance, just like in the 1930s, when Ukrainian artists were being murdered, their manuscript disappearing and their memory wiped away." Unfortunately, Viktoriia became part of the new executed Renaissance herself. On June 27, 2023, Viktoriia was fatally wounded in a Russian attack in Kramatorsk, 30 kilometers from the Eastern Front line. During the dinner, Russians had struck a pizza restaurant known to be a place frequented by aid workers, journalists, and humanitarians. Amelina was inside with a delegation of Colombian writers who had accompanied them to the Donetsk region to raise awareness about war. The attack injured 60 and killed 12, including 3 kids. Viktoriia succumbed to her injuries 5 days later. In her article published in March 2022, Viktoriia said, "While the world debates whether to cancel or to welcome artists and writers who suddenly feel like leaving Russia amidst its economic collapse, it neglects the crucial question, will Russia succeed in executing Ukrainian culture once again?" So maybe instead of debating whether and how the world can decolonize or decenter Russia, we should focus on stopping another executed Renaissance happening right now as I'm speaking, 5,000 miles away from here. The world should stop the Russian colonial war before it's too late again. You might be tired of Ukraine, of Russia's war there. You might think, can we finally talk about something else? Believe me, my parents who live in Ukraine, my friends and my family members who are fighting on the front lines to defend Ukraine are tired of war as well. They want to live in a free and independent Ukraine. They want to feel safe. I want to finish with some calls to action. Please adopt a more balanced approach to Slavic studies. Bring perspectives from other countries rather than Russia. Amplify voices like Viktoriia Savchuk's and Volodymyr Vakulenko's. Partner across disciplines and stop willingly or unwillingly spreading Russian colonialism in academia. Also, if you are a citizen of the US, please call or email your member of Congress and ask to vote yes on supplemental funding for Ukraine. Right now, US Congress is facing a critical decision on aid for Ukraine. If we don't support Ukraine, there will be no one to cite, no cities to spell, nothing to decolonize, and nowhere to conduct research for Slavic, Eastern European, and Eurasian studies. Slava Ukraini. Thank you.
When I was invited to speak on this panel, it took me a while to figure out how do I want to talk about decolonization in practice in 10 minutes? So I had to rewrite my points a few times. So I decided today I will focus on actual research questions and perspectives that I had when I was writing my dissertation, which I defended quite recently. So I thought some of these questions and dilemmas that were in my mind might be relevant to other people as well. So I will start by posing some of those questions, methodological issues, and I'll bring some of the examples from my own research in Central Asia. In the ensuing chaos of World War II, a displaced child, a future Romanian writer, Haralam Zinca, was separated from his parents in a newly annexed Soviet territory, formerly Romanian Bessarabia, thus turning into an unaccompanied minor, to use Soviet wartime terminology. There, in the newly established Moldavian SSR, Zinca was placed in the Soviet orphanage, which was subsequently evacuated to Samarkand, Uzbek SSR. There, in Central Asia, after aging out of the orphanage, this Romanian teenager became the 16th child in a large rural family of an Uzbek man, Abdurasul Jurayev, to whom the former later devoted an essay titled How I Became Uzbek. What did it mean for a Romanian to publicly identify, or rather declare himself an Uzbek? Was it a way of refusing a Soviet identity as an act of defiance and an indirect acknowledgement of his Romanian motherland's socialist quote-unquote occupation? Was it his way of being Soviet in a non-Russocentric way? The generation of war orphans like Zinca played a decisive role in developing a sense of Sovietness that cannot be easily disentangled into a set of one-dimensional ethno-national, ideological, and regional identities. On the whole, historiography of the Soviet wartime evacuation for a long time was dominated by the Russian language sources, which obscured the multidimensional exchange of social practices and cultural values, and as a result focused predominantly on Russification and not on the formation of a hybrid Soviet identity or identities. In my take on Soviet modernity, I rely on the term borrowed from post-colonial theory, namely on hybridity, which is most commonly associated with subalternity, a state of being colonized, not only politically but discursively, that is lacking subjectivity and ability to speak in a language other than the one imposed by a colonial power. Homi Bhabha famously argued that hybridization resulting from the encounter of the colonizer with the colonized is essentially the product of imitation and mimicry. Therefore, colonized subject in this binary structure turns into a mimic man devoid of a subjectivity of their own. A mimic man hybridizes hegemonic discourse from within, remaining unable to produce an alternative, independent self. This partially justifies the predominant focus on the colonial discourse, which in the case of Soviet history implies the focus on center-generated and Russian language discourses. However, such one-dimensional and linear understanding of hybridity is ill-equipped to reflect on the multiplicity of ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and various other types of entanglements characteristic of the complex societies such as USSR. So historiography of the Soviet Union as a result of this has been shaped for a long time by sets of oppositions and corresponding debates such as modernization versus colonization, empire versus state of nations, and so forth. At the same time, the search for the new histories of nationalizing empires and emerging multinational states as homogeneous entities oftentimes produce national post-Soviet histories where ethno-national categories of belonging and exclusion were essentialized and taken at the face value. Attempts to apply post-colonial lens to the Soviet history produced controversial and oftentimes conflicting results, as we already know, depending on the primary function one ascribed to Soviet polity, neo-colonial or neo-imperialist, anti-colonial or post-colonial. So in my work, I try to bring both Russian language sources and Uzbek and other Central Asian sources to hopefully produce a history which is multidimensional and that takes into account lived experiences of various populations. So one example other than the Zinkas that I want to bring is of the famous Shah Mahmudov family. It's the Uzbek family that during World War II had adopted famously 15 multi-ethnic children. So that story had become very popular in the Soviet Union. In my work, I argue that it was Uzbek party leaders, namely Sharof Rashidov, who popularized this story. He basically pitched that story to Moscow and made Shah Mahmudov's, an Uzbek elderly couple, the face of the Soviet multinational family, of the Soviet friendship of people, so to say. So basically, in trying to bring these various sources and various voices and try to look at the familiar stories from new perspectives, I try to maybe complicate the stories that we know and tell them not only as Uzbek national story of Shah Mahmudov's or not only the Soviet history as told from Moscow, but as a hybrid story that is told and reshaped in, a contested story that is created by various actors on various levels, local, regional, national, and so forth. So in that sense, methodologically, I find the concept of imperial situation useful, or open system approach useful in the sense to move beyond the rigidly defined categories of analysis and binary oppositions such as national, supranational, colonial, or anti-colonial, center, and periphery. Imperial situation model assumes coexisting and overlapping identifications, mismatched social hierarchies, and value systems with indefinite or multiple courses of mutual conversion. So I'm hoping that these types of approaches that we might use in history could help us to write, to understand the Soviet society as a complex society, in a sense. So, again, in bringing the Shah Mahmudov story, I wanted to say that it was not the only family, not the only Uzbek family that adopted multiple children during the war, but there were reasons why they had been chosen as the face of the Uzbek adoption movement. So I try to focus in my work on different families that for one reason or the other did not fit into the emerging post-war narrative of Uzbek Soviet modernity and Uzbek Soviet identity. For example, I focus on this woman, Viktoriia Kasimova, who adopted 13 children, but because of the fact that she was not strictly speaking Uzbek ethnically, she was Tajik-speaking from Samarkand province. Her story did not fit to Soviet/Uzbek example of modernity. So by bringing all these different examples, I hope to complicate the story and, the definition of Sovietness and try to show that it was not a, unilinear identification or unilinear story told only from Moscow, or not even the one told only from Tashkent, for example. Thank you very much.
So I want to start off first by thanking Juliet Johnson for inviting me to be part of this important discussion, and also to just thank my fellow panelists for giving me the opportunity to learn from you. I am definitely an outsider on this panel. Decolonization is not a central focus of my research. However, my research on minority rights in the Baltic states does explore how discourses of Russian imperialism and Soviet occupation have shaped minority policies and minority integration in those states. I'm also an American political scientist. I'm a white woman. And so my perspective on decolonization will always be an outsider's perspective on the region. And methodological toolkits that I reach more often for in my own work are those that are most accepted by Western academic institutions. All of that said, I'm really grateful for the opportunity I've been asked to participate in the discussion, because it's forced me to think really critically about my own scholarship and pedagogical practices, and to consider the practical ways in which I can contribute to this larger project of decolonization. I'm going to focus my remarks on how we might think about decolonizing the teaching of Central and Eastern European studies. Decolonizing any field of study requires that we confront really difficult questions about what gets taught and what should get taught. And addressing those questions often means that courses need to be redesigned. It often means that instructors need to learn new material. And these are often not welcome suggestions, given that faculty are already struggling with really heavy workloads. Addressing those questions also means that we as instructors have to confront what we know, what we don't know, and what we can know and what we can't know. And those can be really uncomfortable questions to ask. So it's not surprising that calls for decolonization are often met with resistance. In my brief time, I want to suggest 3 action-oriented frames for thinking about how we might decolonize the way we teach about the region. I call them situating perspective, finding balance, and recognizing agency. None of these frames is particularly novel, and there are a lot of scholars who have talked about doing the things that I'm going to suggest that we try to do as instructors. But I found them really helpful in thinking about what I can do better in the service of decolonization. And I've been reflecting about this a lot in the context of textbooks, as I was recently invited to join the editorial team for the 6th edition of Central and Eastern European Politics textbook, published by Roman and Littlefield alongside editors Zukhra Kasimova and Paula Pickering. Now, in the hopes of making this talk as practical as possible, I'd like to give some examples of how we're trying to intentionally employ those frames in the next edition of the textbook. And I hope that in naming those frames, it's useful for you as you reflect on your own pedagogical practice. The first step towards decolonizing the way that we teach requires situating our own perspective within our field of study. The best advice I ever got from my dissertation advisor was know what you know what you don't know, and know what you can't know. And over the years, I found that really helpful in thinking about how I approach my own scholarship and my own teaching. Decolonizing in practice requires that we are transparent with our students about how our own perspective is shaped by the fundamental disciplinary norms of our field, and also by our relationship to what it is that we study. But it also requires that we recognize that there are multiple ways of knowing about the places that we study. And it requires that we're open to learning from other disciplinary lenses, from other methodological approaches, and from other marginalized voices. And at the end of the day, if we're committed to that program, our course design should reflect that. In the context of the textbook, we've been thinking a little bit about how we might be able to do this, perhaps by including a companion website that would include short videos from chapter authors that might ask them to unpack their perspectives and approach to studying the region as a way to highlight those different perspectives for our students. The second frame is about finding balance in what we teach. Part of finding balance is in making sure that our courses include both insider perspectives and outsider perspectives on the region, as well as finding a balance in methodological approaches. In other words, decolonizing in practice is about more than just replacing a Western scholar with a non-Western scholar from the region on our syllabi. It's about considering the real value added for our students by including a variety of perspectives. Now, the editors of the previous edition of the textbook made a really active effort to recruit more scholars from the region, and several chapters are actually co-authored by scholars who were socialized in really different institutional environments and who bring really different perspectives and different ways of knowing to the volume. And I think it's really important for editors to encourage these collaborations with the goal of expanding the content of what gets taught. After all, what gets taught is in many ways a reflection of what gets published, and theories published in regional languages are far less represented than theories published in top English language outlets. And so collaboration can expose our students to those broader range of theories and perspectives. But at the same time, it's really important to ensure that those collaborations are not exploitative, and that scholars from the regions that we study are equal partners in the creative process of interpreting data and developing theories to help us better understand the places that we study. Finding balance also means making choices about which countries we cover in a single course. Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies have often been dominated by a focus on Russian history, politics, and culture to the detriment of other places. In a department where there are lots of courses taught on these regions and lots of different courses that are offered, it might be less problematic to find that balance. But in a political science department like my own, where I'm the only scholar who does research on Central and Eastern Europe, and I only offer a couple of classes on the region, it's really challenging to make sure that Russia doesn't dominate the content of those courses to the detriment of other case studies. So we've been talking a lot about how to find balance in the textbook as well. Right now, there are 10 thematic chapters and 9 case study chapters, but the former Yugoslav countries are all dealt with in a single chapter, as are the Baltic states. And in general, it's just a lot of material to cover within a single course, or even 2. One idea that we've had moving forward to hopefully make finding balance a little easier for instructors in the next edition is to suggest pairing certain thematic chapters with certain case study chapters as a way to expose students to a wider variety of case studies throughout the region in the course of a single semester. But the reality is that finding balance is also going to be hard, given that many students may be attracted to our classes because they're interested in learning about Russia and they're interested in understanding the war in Ukraine. So discussions about decentering Russia in the curriculum can also be really complicated by student demand. My last point here is that finding balance is not just in the assigned readings on syllabi, but it's also in the speakers that we invite to campus, it's in the postdocs, visiting professorships, and tenure track lines that we fill in our departments. If we want to find balance in the curriculum between insider and outsider perspectives, methodological approaches, and a balance between frequently taught and lesser taught languages, then our faculty needs to reflect that diversity. It also requires that we be intentional about who we are inviting to campus and who we're giving platforms to as guest lecturers. If the same scholars always get the platform, and if those scholars are predominantly from top Western English-speaking institutions, then we're contributing to the problem. But we can also be part of the solution if in department meetings where these decisions are made, we advocate for choices that contribute to decolonizing the curriculum.
And my last point on finding balance is that finding balance is also about training the next wave of scholars. It requires that we establish student exchange programs and fellowship programs so that those students can learn those lesser taught languages. The final frame of action is about recognizing agency. Decolonizing in practice requires that we adopt a pedagogical approach that goes beyond focusing just on centers of power, and one that recognizes the agency of actors and societies in the places that we study. In Central and Eastern Europe, it might be obvious that powerful actors like Europe and Russia have shaped politics in their region in ways that deserve attention in our courses. However, how we teach about their influence also matters. The democratic backsliding that has occurred across Central and Eastern European landscape draws attention to the agency of actors and states that have been targets of democratization.
But a decolonizing the curriculum approach requires that that we acknowledge that democracy means different things in different places, and that we problematize that for our students. The courage of Ukrainians and their willingness to sacrifice forces us to problematize our understandings of Russian power, and we should also problematize the different ways in which those centers of power are understood in different societies. There's obviously a great deal of variation across the region. In the Baltic states, for example, the Soviet era is understood by majority populations as an illegal occupation. Russia is frequently understood as an imperial power, but minority groups view things differently, and views of the Soviet Union and Russia look different in different countries. Similar variation is evident when we think about views of Europe and European institutions, as well as views of the United States and China as centers of power. So decolonizing in practice requires that we problematize those variations and that we recognize that our own lenses of interpretation may be very different from the societies that we're teaching about. We've been discussing how we can better recognize agency in the context of the textbook as well, by encouraging country chapter authors to problematize those centers of power that are discussed in the thematic chapters directly, but also to expand that discussion beyond Europe and Russia to include other centers of power such as the United States and China, as well as local power centers and power dynamics that may be shaped by either resources or identity politics or by Russia's aggression in Ukraine. I want to finish with the acknowledgement that addressing these questions of what gets taught and what should be taught requires that we make some hard choices. But those choices are really critical for ensuring that we impart upon our students an understanding of the regions that we study that is informed by authentic voices and by multiple ways of knowing. Situating our perspective, finding balance in our curriculum, and recognizing the agency of the societies that we study are only 3 frames for thinking about how we can decolonize the curriculum. And there's so much more that should be done. Much of that is being talked about by my fellow panelists today. But I hope at the very least, these 3 frames give us a few places that we can start. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet, for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful, extremely important conversation today that is honestly past high time for our field. To begin, it is important for me to acknowledge and recognize that I am a settler on North America, which the Lenape, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee call Turtle Island. I was born on the land of Tongva peoples, and today I stand before you on the unceded territories of the Lenni Lenape, whose descendants are the Delaware tribe, the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, Ramapo Lenape, Powhatan Lenape of New Jersey, and the Munsee Delaware of Ontario. This land remains the traditional territories of these peoples, and it continues to carry their stories of struggle for survivance. Additionally, I recognize that I am not Indigenous, and I do not claim Indigenous knowledge or theory as my own. I can only speak for how I have learned from Indigenous teachings and how to be a better ally and endeavoring to be a welcome guest on Indigenous land. I was asked today to talk about Indigenous theory and how it can aid in our conversation on the decolonization of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies. So instead of appropriating Indigenous knowledge to prescribe ways of decolonization, I will aim to provide thoughts on how all of us non-Indigenous folks can be better allies through listening, consent, and knowing our limits as settlers. Colonialism is a project that is never complete. As long as Indigenous peoples and their stories continue to haunt settlers, it is a reminder of this fact. Colonialism and settler colonialism, more precisely, seek to eliminate all indigenous peoples physically and discursively in order to replace them with colonizers. If genocidal killings do not solve the problem, colonizers remove them to the outskirts of settler colonial society, such as removing the Lenni Lenape peoples from this land that we now call Philadelphia to places like Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario to disconnect their heritage from their ancestors. In addition, Jean O'Brien, a scholar of Ojibwe descent, reminds us to be wary of how indigenous peoples are also written out of history and colonizer memory, leading towards colonial narratives such as the disappearing Indian. This is what colonialism does. It strips away people from their land and the stories away from memories of indigenous peoples and colonizers alike to justify colonial occupation of land and their continued denial of sovereignty to indigenous peoples. Decolonization, then, is not only a land-back project, but it's also the complete return of sovereignty, and it is the complete dismissal of colonialism, its logics, and its institutions. In their famous paper, Eve Tuck, an Unganak scholar, and Wayne Yang, a settler scholar, assert that decolonization is not a metaphor because there is a concerning trend in the academy to take up decolonization as a hot topic and to conflate decolonization as a synonym for diversification, justice, and or liberal equality. In their words, they say, quote, "When metaphor invades decolonization, it kills the very possibility of decolonization. It recenters whiteness. It resettles theory. It extends innocence to the settler. It entertains a settler future. Decolonize, a verb, and decolonization, a noun, cannot easily be grafted onto pre-existing discourses or frameworks, even if they are critical, even if they are anti-racist, even if they are justice frameworks," end quote. In addition to Tuck and Yang's work, scholars from the Pacific Islands, Asia, and Africa remind us that decolonization is for all indigenous peoples who are subjugated by settler colonial states. Therefore, decolonization does not stop on Turtle Island. Decolonization concerns all indigenous peoples from Turtle Island to Siberia, from Aotearoa to Sankme. So, what are some concrete steps that we can take as settler colonials to become better allies, or as Jessica Hernandez, a Beniza and Maya Choorti scholar suggests, becoming welcome guests? First, and most importantly of all, listen to indigenous voices. What is indigenous leadership saying to settlers on how to help their cause? Listening to their stories, listening to and acting on their calls for action. This is the first and most important step. Indigenous-led movements on Sakhaland, on Chukchi land, on Tuva land, and many others are speaking up against the colonial violence that is perpetrated by the Russian state, such as harsh censorship, imprisonment of indigenous activists, and domestic policies that disproportionately affect indigenous peoples. Just like how in the North American context, indigenous-led movements stood up at Standing Rock to resist the US-backed Dakota Access Pipeline and fight continued dispossession of land. Second, asking for consent as a critical aspect for decolonial praxis. Indigenous peoples have been taken advantage of for the sake of scientific advancement for white people. Indigenous languages, ways of being, ways of knowing, and their belongings and cultural productions have been taken as objects of curiosity by settler colonials to bring back to their colonial institutions, to be consumed as exotic representations of primitiveness. They were never asked for consent for these studies. It was assumed by settler scholars that they could take whatever they wanted from colonized peoples, and that indigenous consent would be a hindrance for scientific advancement. Additionally, this direct type of dispossession is not limited to social sciences or research that directly involves indigenous bodies, but it is also encompassing of their intangible productions, like knowledge, theory, and history. citing and engaging with Indigenous scholarship and not appropriating their thoughts for settler means is critical for this framework of consent. A move towards decolonization means a move away from colonial research models that continually dispossess and towards models of consent that return sovereignty. Asking for consent and creating and maintaining good relationships is key to Jessica Hernandez's idea of becoming a welcome guest. As she quotes her grandmother, who says to her, quote, "Never forget that anywhere you are, anywhere you go, that is not your home. It is someone's home, and you must pay respect and build relationship with the land and the people to become welcomed into their home. Otherwise, you're walking in their home as unwelcome guests." And the last point I would like to share today is to know your limits as a settler scholar. As non-Indigenous peoples, we are limited in our scope to understand the continued violence used by colonial states to dispossess Indigenous peoples. Therefore, there are many issues that we plainly cannot speak on with care. So in accordance with the practice of an ethics of care, one must know when to stop talking and return to listening. Acting within your limits, however, does not mean to do nothing. It means you must take into account all three of these things that I've laid out today, and among many more, and put them in dialogue to critically think about your positionality. As colonialism has recently reared its ugly head in public view again, it is important now more than ever to remember that decolonization is not a metaphor. It is the liberation of Turtle Island to Siberia. And to summarize this point, I want to end my talk today with a poem titled Maps, written by my mentor, Jennie Davis, at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, who is Chickasaw writer and a scholar. This mole, that I prefer to think of as a freckle, is the exact shape of our tribal jurisdiction. Beware. Irregular borders are a sign of cancer, and these passing wagons hide melanoma blankets. Our skins map colonial histories, love stories. Colonial histories retold as love stories. Thank you.
I will not offer any practical tips today, but then again, decolonization is not about following rules. As anything, the practice of decolonization is a disturbance. It is not a comfortable experience. And I say it as a post-colonial subject. And to decolonize even oneself, not even thinking about institutions, is a tough, painful, and unpleasant practice. Instead, I will speak today in a format of creative storytelling, a dystopic narrative, and that is perhaps another angle of practice today. The title is Do Not Despair, a letter to a scholar whose homeland will be attacked by Russia next. Dear friend and fellow scholar, Russia invaded your homeland like it invaded mine in 2014. When Russia escalated its war to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I started my path as an early career scholar in 2022. I'm writing this letter to you about future epistemic trajectories that you will encounter in that never-ending your first year of the full-scale invasion. As the missiles will hit your hometown, you will wake up to the world that suddenly discovered your homeland. The academic field within which you always felt out of place will suddenly develop a sharp interest in your homeland. The institutions that previously turned you down and found your research interest too niche and not relevant to the wider region or bigger agenda will suddenly start inviting you to speak at the events platforming your homeland. You will embrace the steps. Finally, after so many years of marginalization, you will feel heard. And you will use your every opportunity to scream, to speak up. The war will color everything for you, and everything will become a matter of life or death, no less. Scholarship will become an existential affair. Remember, this is not the case for everyone, and they will gently remind you about it. They will mention objectivity, academic rigor. If you do not conform, behind your back they will say, too traumatized to be a rigorous scholar. They will try to allocate you to a safe place in the system. The safe place is a personal story, Sometimes they will need you to come and speak from that personal space on their terms, the local voices section. But you must always remind them that you are a scholar, that your pursuit is epistemic, because knowledge is not disembodied. Knowledge does not exist outside the passion of life. Use the space given to you to speak up, as this won't last long, as it won't always be yours. Academia will talk about decolonization. It will talk about it all the time. But with the exception of the few, it will not talk about your father, brothers, sisters, friends, those in cold trenches, decolonizing through the occupation. That will not be epistemic enough to be discussed. You will make new colleagues, new friends, those who will stand by you, those who will push for change together with you. But good intentions of the few do not mean the realistic possibility of the redistribution of material resources, addressing the inequalities of knowledge production, the inequalities of survival, your survival, the survival of your people. Institutions will tell you, we cannot fundraise for the military, we cannot fundraise for anything, but we can organize a poetry evening. Okay, you will say, you will try to do both. To promote knowledge institutionally and to send donations personally. You will not be satisfied with the addition of authors to the curriculums. You will strive for action, strive to stop the violence on the ground. You will run in a dozen directions at once, trying to make sense, trying to survive. This will exhaust you. The changes in academia will seem exciting to you at first. All those events, statements, and even fellowships. There will be so many fellowships to support displaced scholars from your homeland. You have never seen so many scholars from your homeland in major institutions, in major conferences, even given keynotes. You will believe, here we are making change. Knowledge will never be the same. Your homeland will be running on adrenaline of resistance, and you too will not be able to afford despair. Despair means death. In that moment, do not forget that seeing scholars from your homeland in all the major institutions is a morbid privilege. A morbid privilege for which people of your homeland paid with their lives. And yes, it is a privilege, because the generosity of academia does not extend to all massacres in the world, not even to all massacres in your region. Remember how many other peoples were not granted this morbid spotlight. You will believe in the change with all your heart, like your homeland believes in its freedom. After all, academic institutions put so much effort into bringing you here, bringing others. See, these are visible results. Remember, you cannot afford despair. And you will become the change. You will organize seminars, public programs. You will believe, you can make people understand. You just need to create a platform where they can learn. So you will organize. You will try to fill the gap. And you will also speak at other events incessantly. You will have the support of colleagues, those horrified by the violence, those questioning epistemic responsibility. But you will also notice that other colleagues are either silent or uncomfortable in your presence, or both. You remind them of the war, that ugly thing, that unpleasant disturbance. In your events, you will also notice the same questions, that one about Russophobia, that one about canceling Pushkin. You will wonder why people think these are the most pressing questions, when every day you wake up to the news about death, death, and death. Gradually, you will also notice that for your criticism of academic complicity, you will be framed as hysterical, as naive, as unable to see the positive change, the results of decolonization. That is how they will try to silence you, to disregard your critique. The war will go on, because Russia will not stop, because what Ukrainians, Syrians, Georgians, and others knew about it was true. Everyone and everything back home will become exhausted. You will become exhausted. You will need to find a way to sustain your epistemic struggle, to sustain supporting those living through the war. You will apply for jobs, but almost all tenure-track jobs will be either in Russian or at best in Russophone contexts. Institutions change slowly, you will be told. Be patient, you will be told. We are doing our best, you will be told. We brought you here, you will be told. You must look at the bright side, you will be told. Any academic event you will go on will be on decolonization. Everyone will be decolonizing. Yet the soldiers in trenches will continue to die daily. Cities of your friends will remain occupied. The jobs in non-Russian languages and culture will still be rare. It will become difficult to reconcile these two worlds, pretending that life goes on and knowing that the end of the world already happened. How can you go on living like that? How does everyone just carry on? While you despair, others will retrain to be experts on your homeland overnight. They will obtain grants and embark on research projects. This will be a new academic gold rush. You will be the new academic gold rush, not you as a scholar, you as an object of study. You will feel conflicted, you will try to articulate concern, but you will be framed as ungrateful, as uncooperative. Remember, they always make you believe the problem is you. The war will gradually become normalized. Russian occupation will become normalized. The way the occupation of Georgia became normalized. Does anyone even remember that today? People will start conducting studies on the territories occupied by Russia. Remember? Objectivity, academic rigor, nuance. Nothing personal, nothing political, just the highest standards of knowledge. Studies on the marginalization of Russian scholars, Russian scholarship will start to appear. The short-term fellowships will run out. One by one, colleagues from your homeland will be taken by darkness. The darkness of precarity, the darkness of survival, the darkness of the war. As the war will be normalized, as your people, your homeland will become exhausted, as survival will take up all your resources, they will put you in the corner, turn the page, decolonization over, return to the status quo until the next massacre.
Thank you. Thank you all. Man. Just taking a moment, okay? So, I have one thing I tell my students is that I'm very good at big questions, not necessarily looking into big answers. And so I know this plenary, at least with the subtitle, talked about application or tips or steps or strategies, I can't remember exactly the wording. And so I thank you, Juliet, and to my fellow panelists for having me here. But I also, I think as Darya pointed out, have a lot of questions. And so a lot of those questions really are, I think about them in terms of 4 areas. And so the first is asking a question that I think all of my fellow panelists asked very well, and the same is that, who gets to produce knowledge? I'm a Black woman who does research on race in Albania. I don't do work in the former Soviet Union. I don't do work that I even think is considered Slavic. And so I myself am always grappling with this question of who gets to produce knowledge. I'm an anthropologist, and very often a lot of the field is dominated by certain disciplines looking to the past, looking to literature for a lot of answers. And there are many anthropologists conducting work whose work is not necessarily situated within the broader field. And so, again, to reiterate, who gets to produce knowledge? And what is our region? A question that's been asked as well. What is included in the region? Where does Southeast Europe fit in the region? And what are the frictions and tensions and reasons why so often knowledge production in these areas, knowledge production, particularly on questions of colonization and decolonization, are situated outside of the field of Slavic and Eurasian studies? My second question is really to think about, or I guess my second part to that question is something my colleagues have also brought up, is that in what languages is this work getting produced? Who gets to access that knowledge? What is the funding for that work? How do we think about the jobs? Who gets tenured? Who gets promoted? I'm not going to elaborate too long because I think my fellow panelists did a fantastic job of asking those questions. But again, as we're thinking about knowledge production, these are all tied together. I really think a good question is, and Brian so eloquently gave us some really good definitions and frameworks to think about, but what is decolonization? How are we defining it? How are we engaging questions about it? Are we reading literature about it? Are we teaching courses? Are we taking courses? The word has become very much a buzzword, especially in the field. Very late, though, I tell some of my colleagues and others that feels that we're studying decolonization, and they're like, oh, okay, that was nice. We were doing that 30 years ago. Love to know what you're talking about now. So here's a question to be asked. How are we defining it? With whom are we interacting and engaging? How are we approaching it? How are we learning as we frame our research and our teaching around it? And again, which region are we talking about? Where are we talking about? Who are we talking about when we have conversations about decolonization and what it is? Along that too, because our following theme, has that been announced yet? Am I ruining? Okay, it's been announced. So we're talking about decolonization. We're talking about liberation. So where? What are the broader global questions that we're asking about this? I've heard in a few panels already about the long histories. So the long histories of this term, the long histories that inform and shape our region. But what are the wide geographies that also shape this question? In what ways are we engaging very ongoing and present questions around colonization, around decolonization, around occupation, around war? How are we situating the work that we do? What do we do, to go ahead and refer to some things that my colleagues have already so eloquently talked about with these questions of atrocities and violence, despair? How do we reckon with it? And so part of the reason that I'm also up here is to pose some of these questions, but then to try to synthesize and bring together what we talked about. And so I'm going to try to do my best to do so, recognizing how deep this conversation is and how what we talk about today is not going to be any kind of endpoint on what's going on. And then to refer back to what Darya said about unsettling, how decolonization itself is unsettling, it's ongoing. To go back to what Brian said, it's not complete. And so what then are we opening, are we unsettling? Because that doesn't stop at the end of this plenary, it doesn't stop at the end of this conference. And so the first question I really want to ask is, do we really want to talk about this? So Viktoriia, I believe it was, who said along the lines, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase, or I don't want to mess up the quote, where's Viktoriia? But you said something on the lines of, people are tired of talking about Ukraine. And Darya, in her piece, said that when people are present, you're going to remind them of the war. So there is a question of, do we want to talk about this? But also, I can tell you that as a Black woman who attended a conference broadly on the study of East European and Eurasian studies, I was actually a grad student at the time, presented a paper about my research on race, and then during the Q&A session, someone asked the question and said, but why are we talking about this? And further followed up and said, I'm tired of talking about minorities. Someone else chimed in and said, me too. Why do we have to keep talking about minorities? And then the same person who started the question approached me after the Q&A and said, but aren't you tired of talking about minorities? We don't want to talk about minorities anymore. And then he goes on to elaborate about his personal life, which I didn't ask for. But he goes on to say and try to position himself and where he's coming from. And I asked him, I don't know, what are you trying to say here? I'm tired of talking about oppression too. I'm tired of having to continually engage white supremacy too. I'm tired of having to keep talking about these conversations and apparently falling on ears that don't want to hear them. And so I ask us to really think about, do we really want to talk about decolonization? Do we really want to hear the hard things? And it's something we have to really reckon with and assess for ourselves. Because the truth is, a lot of people may not want to. And so we need to ask why. Because as scholars are coming up here and bravely and vulnerably talking about their research and putting themselves out here, scholars in precarious positions, scholars who are calling out what we see as things that really we need to more urgently address, are saying this, but do we want to talk about it? Do we want to listen? Are we emphasizing more what our response will be, how we would come back or respond to what people are saying? Are we emphasizing listening and hearing? Do we want to have these conversations? And so I have a few more points. Again, thanking my fellow panelists for being here, for participating in this conversation, that I was invited as well to be able to participate in it. And to turn back to this question of stories and what stories get told and how. Who gets to tell the stories? What languages? What archives? I think multiple people have already brought up the archives and the dominant narratives that get told in our research, in our scholarship, as well as in teaching. What are those stories? Are we critically assessing what those stories are? And then what do we do with it, right? Because Jennie raised very excellent points. If we're talking about how they inform our textbooks or our courses or the languages that are offered, because we know that within institutions, there are a lot of restrictions. There are a lot of restrictions about the courses we offer. We have assessments. We have listservs all the time that are asking us, how many students are taking these courses? Who's interested in these courses? So we have data, right? We know there's some really big complex questions to ask. Some students in my program, in our Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, we were tossing out the idea of perhaps moving Russia out or maybe moving Russia to the last term in that field. And some students said, but wait a minute, we also know that when we leave the program and we're applying for jobs, it means something that people see Russia. Some people say, and that's not necessarily a critique of the field as much as it is those who are hiring people who have degrees in the field, right? So yes, we can acknowledge that these are complex questions. And yet, that's not the end of it, because so often that becomes the end. Like it's too complex, or it requires a different kind of approval, or it's too hard. And so we have to say, yes, that might be what people are really pushing back. It's hard. But to go back and quote many of the panelists here, yes, if this is decolonization, this is not supposed to be easy. In fact, it might be harder than hard. But this is about a decolonization as an ongoing process. And we wouldn't need decolonization if people were already willingly agree to participate and act on and address colonial oppressions. We wouldn't be here if that were the case. So, and asking what stories are we getting told and how and by whom, and the work that we're doing, and who gets to make decisions around that. How do we teach? What do we teach? How do we name what we teach? How do we think about decentering? Because decolonization itself is not just decentering, right? But decentering plays an important role. And so again, I speak from somebody who is not only doing work in Southeast Europe, but also coming from a field of anthropology, from the field of Black studies, thinking about ethnic studies, right? And so how do we decenter some of the dominance of certain disciplines and the ways we understand and produce knowledge and the knowledge that we access, the knowledge that we include in our conversations? But then also decentering Russia as a question. That's not decolonization alone, but it is an important question to ask. And it's important to make those distinctions. I really loved what one of our panelists, what Brian had to offer about what does it mean to become a welcome guest? And how do we act with care? How do we hear those types of framings and not just walk away with them and say, oh, that was very provoking, thought-provoking, right? How do we implement them? How do we think about archives and think about Central Asia and think about actually what it means to be a welcome guest? How do we take that question and pose it to people with whom we already work in various regions and ask them what they might think about these questions? How do we engage in conversation and communication and not just let it also be something that we think about and something we write about and we cite it, we don't actually implement it or carry it out in any way? Listening itself too can be a radical act. And as academics, it seems like we're often listening. We go to conferences, we sit for 6, 8, 10 hours. We do a lot of seminars, we do a lot of talking, we do a lot of listening, we do a lot of engagement. But are we really listening to hear? And to whom are we listening? What do fields such as post-colonial studies, indigenous studies, critical Romani studies inform and offer us about the work that we're doing? Because the questions that we're asking are nowhere near brand new, but also there are people within our broader regional field who are asking them and have already been asking them, and we have not acknowledged it. So what do these fields have already offered, and how can we broaden that engagement and conversation and amplify and highlight what's already been ongoing? The panelists here have also brought to light really key questions we have to ask around dispossession, around despair. I think it's around exhaustion. And I think these points are something that we really need to sit with. So yes, this is a very uncomfortable conversation, but it's discomfort that is needed, that is necessary. how do we configure, or rather, let me go back to Darya's question around epistemic knowledge and what makes something epistemic enough, right? To go back to the question of personal stories. What gets considered scholarship and critical and objective, and what's just personal? I think about this question a lot in my own work because part of my own approach is to think not just about race and racialization as social processes and trying to contextualize it in the region, but the reason why I even wanted to do this work is because I showed up in Albania in 2006, and most Albanian folks that I encountered had never seen a Black person before, and yet people knew how to treat me as a Black person. People knew how to call me the N-word. People knew how to ask me questions about race. People knew how to tell me things that they knew about race and how Black Americans or how Black folks were situated in relationship to Albanians, right? People asked me questions about my African lineage and where I was really from in Africa, despite telling them over and over again that I was from the United States, despite trying to talk about the centuries of oppression and enslavement, the reason why I'm from the United States and not from Africa. People knew how to have those conversations. But it was often a lot of the Western scholars and Western folks that I was encountering that were like, but no, there's no race here. No, there's no race here. And if somebody's calling you the N-word, it's ignorance, or it's because of hip hop music that Black folks make. But I said yes, and yet they're not calling you the N-word. And so yes, race is here, race is present. But I write out of that personal space. That's how I even get introduced to, and how I introduce my readers to the topic of race. But some people will say, but is this objective? Like, well, yeah, I'm telling you, because I'm Black and I'm a Black woman in this space, and I'm telling you about how I can then go out and ask ethnographic questions about Blackness and whiteness. Yes, I'm telling you that through long-term and extensive and intensive ethnography. Yes, I'm carrying out the same research that 100 years ago, anthropologists were going out to parts of the world and saying, this is what we're documenting about people, and this is how we know it. And now we're calling that, we're saying, yep, that was colonial forms, we're acknowledging that. And yet we still don't want to acknowledge positionality of scholars. We still struggle to address the ways that scholars are going to engage questions differently because of who they are and who we are in the world. So we have to really ask ourselves, what is knowledge and who gets to produce it and how and why? I'll close or try to bring us to a close. Like I said, I'm really thinking about this as an opening, right? But really, again, going back to what institutions can do and what associations can do. Because I also recognize that some of the questions that are being asked today, particularly as we think about the field, some people might say, well, yeah, the thing is, though, one of the reasons the field, or not one of the reasons, but some of the reasons that the reason why the field itself exists is that many parts of Slavic and Eurasian studies are really marginalized outside of European studies, right? Outside of global studies. And so this is a space to engage Slavic and Eurasian studies. So I want to make it clear that I am not in any way trying to suggest that shouldn't be what we're engaging in our field. I think really a lot of us are asking, but how do we do that? How do we holistically and thoroughly do that in a way that is decolonized? That's part of the key questions. And then institutions do change slowly, but are we even trying to change them? Are we trying to implement radical ways to do so? Because decolonization is radical. Liberation is radical. So what are the efforts that we're actually giving to try to implement that change? Yes, our possibilities are restricted, but it doesn't mean that we should stop being creative and stop thinking about what those could look like, that we can stop demanding what those could be. Thank you.
Thanks for one of the best panels I've ever seen at this time.